These 11 films nobody talks about anymore predicted drone warfare, information warfare, and modern terrorism decades before it actually happened on our news feeds. Hollywood forgot about them. Military analysts didn't. Did you know one obscure 1970s film about asymmetrical conflict was literally required viewing at the Pentagon? These aren't your grandfather's propaganda flicks. They're terrifyingly accurate prophecies wrapped in celluloid. Number 1. Zed, 1969. Costa Gavras made a political thriller so precise in its depiction of authoritarian government crackdown that multiple nations immediately banned it. This film follows the investigation into an assassination of a pacifist politician, but what makes it prophetic is how it shows the machinery of state oppression, how governments manufacture narratives, how they control information, how they systematize violence through official channels. The plot was inspired by the 1963 assassination of Greek politician Gregorios Lambrakis, but the film's technique applies to every authoritarian purge that would follow. Costa Gavras uses rapid cuts, overlapping dialogue, and deliberately disorienting cinematography to mirror how truth becomes fragmented under state control. The viewer doesn't get comfortable answers because victims of political persecution never do. What the film predicted was the rise of surveillance states and information manipulation as weapons more powerful than bullets. When governments learned they could rewrite reality through media control, they stopped needing traditional police states. Yves Montand and Jean-Louis Trintignant deliver career-best performances as men trapped in a system designed to destroy them. The screenplay, adapted from Vasilis Vasilikos' novel, became a blueprint for how institutional corruption actually operates. Test audiences found it too bleak, too aggressive, too challenging. It won the jury prize at Cannes anyway. Critics praised its technical mastery and political courage. The film earned $8.7 million worldwide, which for a French political thriller in 1969 meant something was resonating beyond film festivals. Number 2. The Battle of Algiers, 1966. Guillaume Pontecorvo made one of the most dangerous films ever produced, and Hollywood buried it so deep that most people think it doesn't even exist. This is the ultimate guerrilla warfare manual disguised as cinema, following the FLN's urban insurgency against French colonial occupation in 1950s Algeria. What makes this film absolutely terrifying is its clinical precision. Pontecorvo shows exactly how modern terrorism works, how decentralized cells operate, how to coordinate simultaneous attacks across a city, how propaganda spreads faster than military response. The film presents strategy from the insurgent perspective without apology or moralizing, which is why it's been banned in France multiple times and why the American military actually screened it as a training tool for understanding asymmetrical warfare. The technical accuracy is nightmare-inducing. Every bombing sequence, every strategic decision, every psychological operation feels inevitable because they were all based on actual historical events. What the film predicted was that the future of warfare wouldn't be tanks rolling across open fields but shadows moving through city streets. French Colonel Mathieu, played by Jean Martin, represents the modern occupation force trying to stop an enemy that looks like civilians. He implements brutal counterinsurgency tactics, including torture and collective punishment, yet the FLN's resolve only strengthens. Critics called it propaganda for terrorists. Military strategists called it documentary realism. The film grossed modestly at $2.3 million, but its influence on actual military doctrine became far more valuable than box office numbers. Number 3. Rule of the Game, 1939. Jean Renoir's masterpiece isn't about war directly, but it's the most prophetic film about what happens in the hours before everything collapses. Made just months before Nazi occupation of France, the film follows aristocratic characters at a country estate during the early weeks of World War II. What makes it brilliantly prescient is how Renoir shows society fragmenting in real time. Class divisions, romantic entanglements, and personal obsessions continue while history accelerates around them. The famous poaching sequence has become synonymous with films about blind privilege during catastrophe. Critics initially found it too long and deliberately meandering. Renoir's approach of letting scenes breathe instead of rushing toward dramatic payoffs confused audiences. Yet the film's observational power reveals how ordinary people ignored warning signs until they couldn't ignore them anymore. What the film predicted was how civilization breaks down, not through obvious villainy, but through systematic indifference. Nobody plots evil. Everyone just pursues their own interests while institutions collapse. The cinematography captures golden light even as shadows lengthen. Renoir maintains an almost tragic irony throughout, filming beauty even as he's documenting decay. The film cost 3 million francs, which was expensive for 1939, and made barely a third of that back. Yet film historians now consider it a masterpiece of political prophecy. The restoration in the 1950s revealed Renoir's original vision, longer than theatrical releases, showing his full statement about predestination and human weakness. Number 4. The Night Porter, 1974. Liliana Cavani made a film so disturbing in its implications that it's been nearly forgotten, which is precisely why it deserves resurrection. Set in post-war Vienna, it follows a former Nazi officer and a concentration camp survivor who recognize each other in a hotel and enter into a twisted relationship based on trauma bonding and power play. The controversy around this film is legitimate. Critics attacked it for treating fascism as romantic, for aestheticizing evil, for suggesting that victim and perpetrator could ever be equals. Yet what Cavani actually predicted was the psychological damage fascism inflicts on survivors and perpetrators alike. Neither character is heroic. Both are broken. Both perpetuate cycles of harm. The film doesn't condone what happened. It shows what psychological aftermath actually looks like when society tries to move forward without accountability. Dirk Bogarde and Charlotte Rampling deliver performances of gut-wrenching vulnerability. Bogarde, in particular, plays the Nazi officer as someone trying to escape his past while unable to truly change. The film suggests he'll never leave Vienna, never truly live, forever trapped by what he participated in. What made this prophetic was Cavani's understanding that fascism doesn't vanish after defeat. It infects survivors, perpetrators, and entire societies with lasting damage. The film cost $2.2 million and made barely half that, becoming notorious more for controversy than popularity. Yet military psychologists and trauma specialists study it as an accurate depiction of what occupation and systematic violence does to human consciousness. Number 5. Three Kings, 1999. David O. Russell made what appears to be a heist film set during the 1991 Gulf War, but it's actually a prophetic exploration of how modern warfare fractures into contradictions that soldiers can't resolve. 3 American soldiers discover gold bullion in the Iraqi desert and decide to steal it, but the heist becomes a rescue mission when they encounter displaced Kurdish refugees. What Russell predicted was the moral impossibility of modern warfare. These soldiers are fighting a government enemy but encountering human victims. They're trained to follow orders but confronted by circumstances where orders seem insane. The film's visual style deliberately shifts between documentary realism and dreamlike sequences, showing how combat consciousness fragments. Russell uses gunshot wounds that look genuinely catastrophic, showing flesh trauma in ways mainstream Hollywood typically sanitizes. This was controversial. Test audiences didn't want their entertainment interrupted by graphic injury. Yet Russell understood that sanitizing violence makes war seem manageable, which makes wars more likely. The film cost $60 million, expensive for $1999, but made $82 million worldwide, suggesting audiences were ready for honest depictions of military occupation even if studios weren't. What the film predicted was that future conflicts would increasingly resemble police actions against civilian populations rather than traditional warfare. Soldiers would see enemies one moment and refugees the next. This moral whiplash, which Russell captures perfectly, became the dominant experience of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. Mark Wahlberg, George Clooney, and Ice Cube all deliver career-best work, showing how intelligence and decency mean nothing when your orders contradict your humanity. Number 6. Special Forces, 2011. Stéphane Riboujad made an absolutely brutal French special operations film about a hostage rescue mission in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, and it's been nearly forgotten despite being technically flawless. The film doesn't sentimentalize soldiers. Instead, it shows them as professional instruments operating in an impossible situation. A French journalist is captured and a special forces unit is deployed for extraction. What makes this film prophetic is its refusal to present American or NATO involvement as justified. The soldiers are competent, professional, even sympathetic, yet their mission occurs within a losing war. The Taliban fighters, portrayed as determined rather than monstrous, operate from their own rational motivations. Russell doesn't ask viewers to choose a side. He shows how all sides are trapped in a conflict nobody's winning. The combat sequences were filmed in Romania, standing in for Afghanistan, with genuine military advisors ensuring tactical accuracy. When a soldier gets injured, the medical response matches actual field medicine. When operations go wrong, the fallout feels authentic rather than cinematic. The film cost 30 million euros and made barely 5 million, suggesting audiences wanted either hero narratives or villain narratives, not the morally ambiguous reality Riboujad presented. Yet military personnel and counterinsurgency specialists recognized its documentary-level accuracy. What the film predicted was Western disillusionment with forever wars. As audiences increasingly understood that Afghanistan and Iraq would never be won through conventional military means, films showing professional soldiers undertaking impossible missions became more prophetic than patriotic propaganda. The film's depiction of cultural misunderstanding as the real enemy, more than Taliban bullets, anticipated later analysis of how military occupation fails when soldiers can't win hearts and minds. Sometimes preventing tragedy through force is possible. Usually it's not. That contradiction, which Ribojad captures perfectly, defines modern conflict. Number 7. Paths of Glory, 1957. Stanley Kubrick made an absolutely merciless indictment of military hierarchy and how institutions sacrifice individuals to protect reputations. The film follows a colonel defending 3 soldiers court-martialed for cowardice after a doomed offensive that their own officers ordered. What makes this prophetic is Kubrick's understanding that military justice isn't about justice, it's about hierarchy and optics. Officers order suicidal attacks, then blame enlisted men when attacks fail. The system protects itself by punishing the powerless. Kirk Douglas delivers one of cinema's greatest performances as Colonel Dax, a man trapped between military duty and human decency, ultimately discovering they're incompatible. The court-martial sequences remain unbearably tense because Kubrick understands that watching institutional machinery destroy innocent people creates more horror than any combat footage. The film cost $900,000 and made barely $1.2 million, suggesting audiences found its cynicism too dark for entertainment. Yet what Kubrick predicted was the coming crisis of faith in military institutions. When soldiers understand that officers will sacrifice them for strategic advantage, when enlisted men see that generals face no consequences for catastrophic decisions, morale collapses faster than any enemy attack. The film was so politically explosive that French generals tried preventing its release in France, fearing it would damage military recruitment. Kubrick maintains formal distance throughout, shooting beautiful compositions of men walking to execution, creating cognitive dissonance between visual beauty and institutional evil. Number 8. Come and See, 1985. Elem Klimov made perhaps the most devastating anti-war film ever produced, and it remains nearly unwatchable for most audiences. This Belarusian film follows a young boy who joins Soviet partisans during Nazi occupation and descends into a nightmare of massacres, starvation, and apocalyptic destruction. What makes this prophetic isn't its depiction of past atrocities, but its understanding of how trauma transforms consciousness. The film doesn't show suffering, it shows the end of innocence, the moment when a child becomes aware that humanity contains infinite capacity for cruelty. The cinematography becomes increasingly hallucinatory as the boy's perception fractures. Sound design creates psychological vertigo. The famous ending, where the child ages in reverse through photographs of Hitler while gunshots accompany each image, transforms historical photos into visceral horror. What the film predicted was how modern warfare, when mediated through media, becomes surreal and incomprehensible. We watch atrocities on screens, we share them on social media, we move to the next story. Klimov understood that constant exposure to horror creates psychological numbness more dangerous than ignorance. The film cost 3 million rubles and made almost nothing commercially because who pays to experience apocalyptic trauma? Yet film scholars recognize it as the most accurate depiction of war's psychological devastation ever created. The boy actor's actual aging throughout production adds meta-commentary about how war accelerates physical and spiritual decay. When military psychologists needed to understand combat trauma and PTSD, they studied Klimov's visual language because it matched veterans' accounts of psychological fragmentation. The film is difficult not because it's artsy, but because it refuses to let viewers feel comfortable observing atrocity. Number 9. Johnny Got His Gun, 1971. Dalton Trumbo adapted his own anti-war novel into a film so deliberately challenging that mainstream audiences rejected it completely. The film follows Joe Bonham, an American soldier so catastrophically wounded that he's reduced to consciousness, trapped in a paralyzed body, blind, deaf, and limbless. Unable to communicate, he exists in a sensory void, experiencing time as meaningless torture. What makes this prophetic is Trumbo's refusal to make Joe's suffering noble. There's no learning, no growth, no higher purpose. There's just endless agony that military and government systems ignore. The cinematography deliberately disorients. Sound and vision separate. The editing creates psychological claustrophobia, despite depicting Joe's physical entrapment. Trumbo shows that war wounds don't heal. They persist as permanent reminders of how systems sacrifice individuals for abstraction. The film cost $1.2 million and made barely $600,000, suggesting audiences found it unbearable, which was Trumbo's intention. He wanted viewers to feel Joe's psychological nightmare rather than sympathize from distance. What the film predicted was the coming generation of invisible injuries, traumatic brain injuries, PTSD, moral injury, conditions that destroy people's ability to function without visible wounds that society acknowledges. Modern soldiers return with psychological wounds that look like healing to observers who see no scars. Trumbo understood that this invisibility makes suffering worse. If Joe had visible stumps, society might acknowledge his horror. Invisible trauma gets ignored. The film's final sequence, where Joe attempts communication through Morse code and military systems immediately move to suppress his message, shows government's preference for propaganda over inconvenient truth. When veterans organizations need to illustrate the permanent devastation war creates, they cite Trumbo's unflinching approach as prophetic. Number 10. The Attack, 2012. Zia Doueri made a film about an Arab-Israeli doctor whose wife commits a suicide bombing, forcing him to confront complicity, loyalty, and identity. What makes this prophetic is its refusal of easy political positioning. The film shows that understanding another person's motivations doesn't mean endorsing their actions. The doctor's wife had political reasons, psychological damage, and community pressure. Understanding all three doesn't make the bombing justified. Yet the film also shows how occupying forces radicalize populations faster than education or diplomacy. The attack is wrong. The conditions that created the attacker are also wrong. The film cost $7 million and made barely $8 million, yet it premiered at major international festivals because it addressed the question nobody wants to discuss. How do ordinary people become radicalized? What the film predicted was the coming crisis of information warfare, where each side's narrative appears absolutely true to believers. The doctor's friends see his wife as terrorist. Her community sees her as freedom fighter. Both interpretations contain truth. Neither contains the whole story. Modern warfare increasingly happens through competing narratives rather than actual weapons. Doueri understood that this creates psychological fragmentation. The film's power comes from showing how identity politics poison communities. The doctor's Arab ethnicity, which he thought protected him, becomes meaningless when religious identity supersedes national identity. What's prophetic is how Doueri shows that modern conflicts create no safe positions. Everyone becomes implicated regardless of ideology. Number 11. A Prophet, 2009. Jacques Audiard made a prison film that's actually a prophecy about how institutions radicalize ordinary people through systematic dehumanization. Malik, a young man imprisoned for a small crime, enters prison unpolitical and emerges as revolutionary through observation and survival. What makes this prophetic is Audiard's understanding that radicalization isn't ideological indoctrination. It's systemic dehumanization that transforms survival into resistance. The prison becomes metaphor for any closed system. Military units, religious institutions, governmental agencies. When authority dehumanizes subjects, some subjects inevitably become radicalized against authority. The film cost €10 million and made $25 million worldwide, becoming popular enough to suggest audiences recognized its political commentary. What the film predicted was how modern institutions inadvertently create the resistance they claim to be fighting. Military occupation creates insurgency. Harsh prisons create political prisoners. Systematic discrimination creates radicalization. Audiard shows this not through political speeches, but through daily degradation. Malik doesn't choose resistance through ideology. He chooses it through necessity. The cinematography remains beautifully composed even in depicting institutional brutality, which creates cognitive dissonance, perfect for understanding how radicalization occurs despite awareness of its destructiveness. When security analysts study why prison systems fail, they reference Audiard's technique of showing how legitimate authority becomes illegitimate through application. The film's final sequence, where Malik appears to achieve power, maintains ambiguity about whether he's actually transformed the system or merely become its newest iteration. That refusal of resolution is prophetic. Real institutional change doesn't happen through individual success. It requires systemic transformation, which remains perpetually unrealized. These 11 films predicted our future not through crystal ball prophecy, but through understanding human nature under pressure. They showed what happens when systems prioritize abstractions over individuals, when technology distances operators from consequences, when good people serve destructive purposes, when trauma perpetuates itself across generations. Which of these films shocked you the most? Which ones did you actually know about? Here's the real question. Why are the most accurate prophecies about modern warfare coming from filmmakers Hollywood forgot instead of from strategic planners and political leaders? Drop your thoughts below and prepare for someone to argue that you've completely missed the point.